This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it's time for Avoid the Maze, your journey through life. You're not going to get out of the maze. We're all going to be in the maze at some point of our life, maybe multiple times. My guest today is Mike Fink, and I have to tell everyone, when I read his bio in podmatch.com, I thought, where was he? Almost 50 years ago when I was going through a divorce. I didn't see it coming. It happened. When it happened, I ran as fast as I could because my feeling was, if you don't want me, I don't want you. And I look back at that and was a mean, angry person for a very, very long time. Probably within the last 20 years, I've realized that my ex-husband did me a favor because he knew we weren't right for each other. I sort of did, but I didn't want to admit it. But my question right from the beginning, Mike, as you tell us your journey, our listeners are going to say, how can a man know what a female needs if they're going through a divorce?
That's a great question, Karen. So let me start by telling exactly what I do, which is I actually help women considering divorce make the right decision with confidence, because I have developed a process that's very unique, very new, very revolutionary, and I'll be more than happy to share what makes it so different. But you have a great point. Why, as a man, can I help you? And for that, I will share a little bit of my story, which will answer the question, at least in part, because there's a saying that your wounds are your gifts. And basically, the process that I discovered and where I am today helping women considering divorce is the result of more than 2 decades of expertise in the field of personal development and 5 long, grueling years being stuck in a relationship where I was absolutely stuck in indecision. And basically, the first decade was okay. The second decade, though, I got into a 50-50 business partnership with a gentleman. And the first 5 years were okay. But then the market conditions started changing. We needed to make some new decisions, decide about the future. And that's when things became clearer and clearer that our values were different. And that he was going this way, I was going that way. And the chasm was becoming more and more apparent every day, where we're starting having arguments, we're starting to scream at one another, even in front of our employees, which I felt ashamed about after that. So it became really, really bad. But the whole thing was that for 5 years, the biggest problem I was facing was not that I was unhappy in the relationship. And by the way, I'm not blaming him. It was just like not a good fit. The biggest problem that I was facing was indecision. And basically, I say that the number one problem that women considering divorce face, it's not being in a unhappy relationship, is the problem of indecision, because the things that keeps you awake at night, it's not the argument that you had during the day. It's the question, should I stay or should I go? The things that make it so that you are not able to be fully present with your kids, when you are with them, it's like, am I being authentic? I cannot really be myself because I'm not happy with dad, but I'm in front of my kids. All those things, the things that keep you distracted at work, are indecision. So in a way, the answer that I can give is, the first thing is that I understand the pain of indecision, which is gender neutral. It's not necessarily specific to women or to men. And the fact is that if I had not gone through that pain myself, because it can be disruptive on all fronts. I burned out. I didn't know it was possible, but you can actually burn out. I had health issues. I had anxiety. I had sleepless nights. My life was in shambles. And really, I came to realize that indecision is like chronic pain.
Yes.
Some days are worse. Some days are better. But overall, your quality of life is miserable, and it gets worse over time. So answer number one is, I can help women in their situation because I understand the pain, the real pain that they're facing, which is indecision. Number two, and I'll get to number two after I share how I came to make my wound my gift, is after 5 long years of pain and struggle and not knowing, by the way, I was in pain, but I kept asking myself, is it me? Is it him? Is it the relationship? Am I right or is he right? I kept second guessing myself. Or even when I thought, it's not working, I should pull the plug or pull the trigger and end the relationship, then I was scared. Well, what if I can't make it by myself? I'm going to have to buy him out. Where am I going to get the money to buy him out? Am I going to be able to start from scratch? So very, very similar fears and concerns related to what most women have. So after 5 years, I finally hit my 50th birthday and I did a life review. And I realized that I had made many mistakes like most people have done in their life, but I got most of my big decisions right. Moving to Canada, being with my current spouse. And I got those decisions right because I had applied a process that I had developed over time through my expertise in the field of personal development. But somehow, for some reason, I did not apply that process when I decided to get into that 50-50 business partnership. Even though with hindsight, I remember that I had those gnawing feelings, those kind of little voices saying, oh, are you really sure? But because I was not able to justify it rationally, I couldn't explain it. Therefore, I just shoved it under the rug, like most people do, right? And then I realized, okay, if I had this process that works, let's apply my own medicine. And when I did, Karen, this is when my life completely changed. I went from being anxious, depressed, not knowing what to do, to all of a sudden, having peace of mind. I knew what I needed to do. I had alignment with my head, with my heart, with my guts. I just became this different person. Everybody around me could see it. And I knew that the right decision was to end the relationship. And I did. And it was unpleasant. It was painful. I had to sell an asset. It left me financially depleted. But I knew deep within myself it was the right thing to do. And I was able to figure things out as I went. And finally, then after 6 months, my spouse's brother, who's a doctor, had to make some very difficult decisions in terms of his medical career. And he had been mulling over for 2 long years what to do. And again, he was stuck in indecision. He was doing Excel spreadsheets, reading articles, talking to everybody about his choices, and yet he couldn't get it. He had anxiety, he had nausea when he was thinking about it. So I said, let me take my process, which I improved in the meantime, and let me see if I can help him. And in 2 hours, I took him from absolute anxiety and confusion to absolute clarity and determination. And he told me, Mike, it's incredible. It's as if I had been stumbling in a pitch dark room for 2 years, bumping myself against furniture and hurting myself. And all of a sudden, you turned on the light. And now I can see clearly. So that's when I realized, okay, I have put my finger on something incredible. I need to share it with the world. And then I realized I can help people make complex, meaning there's a large number of variables to consider, and high cost of failure decisions, meaning that if you get it wrong, well, you're probably going to regret it for a long time. It's going to have devastating consequences on many fronts. And if you think about what kind of decisions are complex and high cost of failure, well, divorce is one of the toughest decisions a human being can make. And I kind of went through my own divorce. Yes, it was a business divorce, but as we saw, it was the pain of indecision. And then I started working with women. And another reason why I can help women is because a woman goes maybe once, twice, hopefully not 3 times through a divorce. But I have literally explored all the angles, all the issues, all the challenges related to divorce hundreds of times by having talked to so many women. So that gives me a depth of experience that any woman doesn't have, unless maybe they're marriage counselors, who knows? But that's the long answer to why I can help women. Does it make sense?
Yes, it does. And as I'm listening to you, your philosophy, your program, whatever we want to call this, okay, helps all people, not just women through divorce. I know that I've always been somebody who's worn my heart on my sleeve. And growing up, my parents would say to me, it's going to come back and haunt you. And that's really what happened in my divorce. Okay. As soon as he said, I don't want this anymore, it was all about, it must be me. And everybody saw that. And I had people saying to me, there were two of you in this marriage. You didn't do it all. Maybe you did 51%, maybe you did 60%, but were you doing what you thought you needed to do? And when I realized I hadn't been. I was walking around probably like your brother-in-law, very this dark space, hitting the wall, thinking there's no way out. And yes, I'm going to be divorced and I'm going to be alone and oh, woe is me. I didn't stay there very long. Something like snapped and said, you can do it. And yes, you're probably going to cry. You're probably going to feel miserable. You're going to have to rework things. But now you got to take it from the bottom of your gut and bring it up. And I don't know where I got that wisdom from because my parents didn't tell me, my best friends didn't tell me, but that's what I've used from that point forward. If something doesn't feel right and it's in your gut, you got to bring it out. Because that's the only way you're going to find if you should go right, left, or, just stay there for a while.
It's very interesting what you say because you talked about bringing your gut, right? And this is one of the elements that I use in the process, which is really this alignment between your head, your heart, and your gut. And let me show you, and for the listeners, I'm going to describe what I have in my hand, but
Sure.
Right now I have two Rubik cubes. One is completely jumbled and one is completely aligned, solved, right? So like the jumbled Rubik cube is like when you're confused, and the solved Rubik cube is like when you have clarity. Now, even though one is jumbled and the other one is solved, here's a question for you. Are there any pieces missing in terms of the color stickers or smaller number of cubes? Are there any pieces missing in the jumbled cube compared to the other one?
No, they're all the same colors. They're just in different places.
Correct. It's exactly the same. All the pieces are already there. The difference is that they are not in the right order. And there is an algorithm, you can go on YouTube and look how to solve a Rubik cube to basically take those existing elements and organize them in the proper sequence to go from a jumbled Rubik cube to a solved Rubik cube. And the reason I'm using this analogy is that, in a way, what I have discovered is that we already have the answers, all the necessary elements of the answer within ourselves. We just don't know how to make sense of them. And if you know how to take them and organize those pieces of information in the right order, in the right sequence, then you will always be able to get to the right answer. And what I have discovered is the following, is that number one, the divorce decision is one of the toughest decisions you will ever make because usually whenever you make a life change, whether it's divorce or quitting your job or deciding to move to a different state or whatever that is, it usually gets worse before it gets better. And in the case of divorce, that's quite pronounced. It will get worse on many, many fronts. So you already know that if you pull the trigger, it's going to get worse before it gets better. So if you don't have absolute certainty that it will get better, well, you're going to stay and stay back, right? Now, why is that? And I'm going to talk about how our brain works. But the thing is, before you can make a decision to move forward, and your case was a little bit different because you were on the receiving end of the divorce. The reality is that 69% of divorces are actually initiated by women. So they're the ones who have to make the decision, and they're the ones who have to, quote unquote, live with the consequences of their decision if they are the ones initiating it, right?
Right.
So if you don't have absolute certainty that your marriage can be saved and that it is worthwhile moving forward, you're going to stay stuck. And why are you going to stay stuck? So I'm going to show you something else. I'm going to describe it again now for your listeners.
Okay.
I have a mock-up of the brain here, and you can think about your brain as an ice cream cone with 3 scoops of ice cream, one on top of the other, each one covering the previous one. So the first scoop of ice cream is what we call the old brain, the reptilian brain, the primal brain. You probably have heard this term, right?
Right.
And this brain is in charge of survival, is the one in charge of the fight or flight response, is the one in charge of saying, you know what, I'm here to keep you safe. Now, there's a second scoop of ice cream on top of that. That's the emotional brain. It's called the limbic system, which is in charge of our emotions. And then there's finally a third scoop on top of everything. It's the neocortex. It's the most recent addition. It's the part of our brain that is in charge of reasoning, of logic, and of language. So it so happens that we're trying to make a decision that is very high in terms of cost of failure. I'm going to talk about, how complex it is to make in a moment. But since that decision is so dangerous to get, if you get it wrong, your primal brain here says, you know what, when in doubt, wait it out. Because in addition to the fight or flight response, there's also the freeze response. Karen, have you ever seen a movie? It's an action movie, maybe it's Indiana Jones, and all of a sudden they are being pursued by all those villains, and they run, and there is this suspended bridge that's shaky with, rotten wood, pieces of wood that kind of make up the bridge and with ropes. Right. And then the woman who follows Indiana Jones goes, and then all of a sudden she looks down and she realizes, oh my goodness, if I make a misstep, I will just fall to my death. And she freezes. She's not moving forward, she's not moving backwards. Why? Because that part of your brain, the old brain, the reptilian brain says, hey, when in doubt, wait it out. If I can make you survive in the short term, I have better chances of making you survive in the long term. Which is partially true because you don't die, but at the same time, you cannot stay forever in that frozen position.
Right.
So in a way, we have our part of our brain that is biologically programmed to keep us stuck in this, what I call indecision prison, because it thinks it's helping us when instead it's actually harming us because you cannot stay forever frozen. Well, now, the reason I mentioned that we have those three pieces of brain is because if you don't have absolute clarity in terms of what the right decision is, you're not going to move. Now, the next step is, though, even if you have logical clarity in terms of, okay, now I do realize that I should move on because my marriage is never going to work, then there's another thing, which is how do you communicate that decision, that clarity to all parts of your brain? And here's an important piece of information. The old brain, the reptilian brain, was formed 500 million years ago. So that's the first scoop of the ice cream. The second scoop of the ice cream was formed about 200 million years ago. And the most recent part, the neocortex, the one in charge of logic, of reasoning, of language, was formed 2 to 3 million years ago. And what does that mean? Well, it means that the primal brain and the emotional brain were formed before we developed language. That means that these two parts of the brain do not understand words. Let me repeat it because this is huge. They do not understand words. And why is this huge? It is because all the solutions that people traditionally seek in terms of trying to get clarity, whether it's talking to friends, talking to family, reading, marriage counseling, therapy, talking to a lawyer, what do all those solutions have in common, Karen?
You're asking for information, but you're not really understanding the information you're getting back. And you probably don't have a good way of expressing it either, because I knew that was my biggest problem. When I went home to tell my parents, I think about that occasionally, that I made no sense. They kept looking at me like, you're getting divorced because this happened the other night. And that's where I was stuck. It happened on a night, and that's all I could think about. That's what broke me up. It was many years later that I looked at it and said, oh, there was 7+ years of information that I didn't bring to them.
Absolutely. So the point that you're bringing is very powerful, which stands for the fact that a lot of times there is this kind of dissonance between our head, what we understand logically, our emotions are going on in our gut. And when they're not aligned, it means that even though we feel, maybe you felt on a gut level that the right thing was to move on, but you could not express it verbally, logically. Why? Because there was not a proper understanding of your emotions that and in a way that you would be able to express them to yourself and to others. Now, if you think about the solutions or the traditional solutions to get clarity, marriage counseling, therapy, talking, what they all have in common is they all use language. They all use words. And we just saw that those two parts of the brain, the the parts of your brain that are the gatekeeper of your decision that keep you frozen do not understand words. So even if you have clarity on a logical level, it doesn't help much because your brain says freeze, just like the woman on the suspended bridge. Logically, she knows I should move because I cannot stay here forever. I'm going to starve. But the brain says, no, freeze. So if words and language and logic are not the way to communicate with those parts of the brain, with the emotional brain and the primal brain, what is the way? And rather than me giving you the answer, I'm going to lead you through a thought experiment so that we come up with the answer together, okay? And so will your listeners. So yes, you do have children. I remember reading that from your biography. So just go back in time and imagine when you had a child who was about maybe 12 years old in middle school. And I would assume that if you were to find out that your child is being physically bullied at school, you would be very upset, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we know that. Now, let me guide you through this thought experiment. I'm going to give you the exact same piece of information, which is that your child is being physically bullied in school, but in 4 different ways. And let's find out how each reveal modality, if you wish, impacts your level of being upset. So the first scenario, a person comes and tells you, Karen, your child is being physically bullied at school, but you don't know what the child doing the bullying looks like. You would be upset, correct?
Right.
Okay. Let me give you a second scenario. A person comes and tells you, Karen, your child is being physically bullied at school, but this time you know what the child doing the bullying looks like. Would you be less upset, just as upset, or more upset?
I'm going to be more upset.
More upset. Okay. Third scenario. A person comes, they don't even tell you anything, but they just show you pictures of your child being physically bullied by another child. Are you less upset, equally upset, or more upset?
I am now furious.
Okay. Let me take that with a fourth scenario. You drive to school to pick up your child, you get off the car, and then you physically witness, you see with your own eyes live, your child being physically abused by another child. How is your level of upset now?
I'm the grizzly bear mama. Yeah.
Okay, through the roof, right? So let's examine this for a second because there was a crescendo of upset, right? You were upset at the beginning, but then it became more and more and more. And yet, it was the exact same piece of information. Your child is being bullied physically at school. What was the difference, Karen?
The first was just a mention of it. And the strange part is my son was bullied in school, and this is sort of how I learned about it. So at first it was, okay, he's being bullied. So I questioned my son about, are you doing anything to get his attention? What is your part in it? When I got more information, I sat him down and tried to tell him the old school, just walk away, ignore him, but knowing that wasn't going to help. Third stage, I really don't remember, but the fourth stage, when I finally found out, I just went to the authorities because it was more than just a verbal bullying, or hitting him. But I think in the beginning, you just sort of take it as, that's not a good thing. How can we resolve it? When you get to that fourth step, in my case, my only way of resolving it was to be very verbal, to the point that I will tell you a number of people in the community just totally stopped talking to us because that kid could not bully my kid.
Absolutely. And if we think about, because I'm very sorry, by the way, to hear what happened to your child, because it's probably one of the hardest things that a parent can experience because we want to protect our children and so on. And in terms of the thought experiment that I led you and our listeners through, it was the exact same piece of information. The difference was your ability to visualize. The first time you were just being told, that your child was being bullied. In the second scenario, you were being told, but you knew what the other child looked like. So it was easier for you to create a mental image of that.
Right.
Third scenario, you were shown pictures. So the images were right there. In fourth scenario, you saw it live. So it means that the more you're able to visualize it, the more it impacted your emotions. And that means that in order to communicate with those parts of your brain that are the gatekeepers of your decision, the primal brain and the emotional brain, you need to use visual communication. And none of the traditional solutions do that. So I have developed this process. Then I'm going to give you more information because I'm very passionate and I want people to know how to do that. That not only helps you get clarity on a logical level, so you understand your own emotions, your own needs, whether they are being fulfilled or not, in a way that you can explain logically, but also that aligns your logical mind with your emotional mind, with your intuitive mind, so that they are all getting on board. And does that make sense so far?
Oh, yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Okay. So is that okay if I give you like what the steps are for people to get clarity and do that? Very good. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the most important thing is having clarity as to whether you can save your relationship or not. And many people say, but how can you have clarity beforehand? And I say that in a way, doing marriage counseling is a little bit like putting the cart before the horse, because marriage counseling will give you specific tools to try to improve your relationship. It gives you the how, but you need to be clear on the what and the why in the first place. Because if you don't know what is essential versus optional, maybe your spouse will make improvements on some things that are optional to you, but not on the real needle movers.
Right.
And then it can actually make the situation worse because all of a sudden, your spouse has shown that he or she's made efforts, but not on things that matter to you. So now you feel even more guilt if you are to pull the trigger. So the analogy that I use is, imagine that you want to take a road trip from New York City to LA. Well, you have two choices. You could either take your car hoping that it's in good enough shape to get you through the entire, coast-to-coast trip, or you can make sure beforehand, taking the car to the mechanic to make all the checks. And a car has some things that are essential for it to function properly and to get you through the trip. Some others are optional. If the steering wheel doesn't work properly, that's pretty essential, right? If your brake pads are almost worn out, that's pretty essential. But if the air vent doesn't work, or maybe the adjustment of the electric passenger seat doesn't work, that may be annoying, but you would still be able to make it. So in a way, if you make the assessment in terms of what are the things that are working, not working, but what are the most essential ones, then that gives you a way to know with certainty whether it's a good idea to keep this car to do the trip or not. Does that make sense?
Sure does.
Perfect. So the first step is, how do we make that decision regarding our relationship? And step number one is to gather all the pieces of the puzzle, because most people focus just on a few variables. I remember I had this client, Felicia. Her husband cheated on her. She found out only after the fact. And she was devastated. They had been married for 8 years, and she had been struggling with a divorce indecision for the previous 2 years, because even after he made amendments, even after they had gone to marriage counseling, even after he had joined a sex addiction group, therapy group to supposedly help him, she found out that he had cheated again. She was devastated. But here's the thing. She was like, I cannot do this anymore. I cannot take him being unfaithful. But he's such a great dad. And she was keeping on going between, I can't take this anymore, but he's such a great dad. Bing, boom, bing, boom. She was flipping back and forth between those pros and cons. And this case may sound extreme because I'm just taking 2 variables into consideration. But most women, in reality, consider just a few factors, a few variables in their relationship, and they keep going back and forth. So step number one is gathering all the pieces of the puzzle, because think about a jigsaw puzzle, which is, if you have 1,000 pieces jigsaw puzzle, but you have only 200 pieces, what are the chances of you being able to solve it?
You won't.
Absolutely, right? So we want to gather all the pieces of the puzzle, including the ones that you may not be necessarily aware of. Now, here's a question, and I know I may catch you off guard, but that's okay, because it will be the same with the listener. Whenever you think about your ideal relationship or your ideal partner, how many things do you believe are, should you consider in terms of your ideal relationship? Maybe you want somebody who's a good listener, who contributes to house chores, who has a good sense of humor, whatever that is. A number of characteristics of variables, a number of things that are important to you. How many things do you think are important in a relationship for most people?
There's probably only maybe a handful initially, when you meet somebody, because there's that attraction. So it's, I want to make sure that this person is kind, understanding, loves me, wants to do it for the long haul. You don't think about, at least I didn't think about anything else. Okay. And I know when I got married the first time, it was more about, I wanted to be married. Okay. I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and everybody that I knew was getting married by the time they were 21, and here you're 20 years old and you meet somebody and you think, I better hold on to this person so that I too can get married at 21. Second marriage was totally different. And we've been together 40 plus years. So, but I think one of the things about me is I don't have expectations of other people, but I have too many expectations for myself.
Interesting. Okay. So I love what you said and what you shared in terms of you wanted somebody who is kind, and you mentioned a few other things, and that's about a handful. The reality is that most people, whether men or women, have between 20 to 30 things that are important to us. That sounds like a lot for most people, but the reality is that if you really take the time to dig deep and start listing things and articulating them, that's, in my experience, between 20 to 30. And if that seems a lot to you and to the listener, that is the sign number one that you are not considering all the relevant variables that are important to you. So that's why step one is you want to gather everything so that you consider everything, because maybe some things may not be immediately relevant, but if you're considering a lifelong relationship, those things will play out over time. So you want to have all the pieces of the puzzle. Does that make sense so far?
Yep, sure does.
Very good. Number two is once you understand all the things that are important to you, you want to know and to establish what is more important versus less important, what is essential versus optional, whether there are any clear deal breakers. And this is where most people get lost, because most people will be able to give you a short list or maybe a longer list of pros and cons, pros if I stay, pros and cons if I stay, pros and cons if I go, but they keep bouncing back and forth between those pros and cons. Why? Because they know that those things are important, but they don't know what's more important versus less important. And the reason this is so crucial is that I have a saying that values, meaning the things that are important to us, are not an equal vote democracy. They are a military hierarchy. And let me guide you again through another mini thought experiment to illustrate what I mean. Let's say that you're looking for your dream house, and let's say that there are 20 things that are important to you in your dream house. Maybe you want a garage, maybe you want 4 bedrooms or a bright house, whatever that is. You have 20 things. And then one day a friend of yours comes and says excitedly, Karen, I have found your dream house. It has 19 out of the 20 things that are important to you. Well, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
For me, that's still a good thing because it's almost a 20. But for a lot of people, I said 20, so therefore I need the 20.
Well, that's an interesting answer. And let me give you this perspective. The reality is that it depends, because it all depends on which one is missing. What if the one missing, you could say, well, 19 out of 20, that's 95%, that's a go. But what if the one missing is that this house is in a different state and city that you want to live in? Everything else becomes a moot point, right?
Right.
If on the other hand is, well, I wanted to have a walk-in closet that's, I don't know, 12 by 12 and it's 10 by 10, it doesn't matter that much, right? So it all depends on which one. So this is an extreme example, but it goes back to really underlining the importance of understanding what is essential versus optional, because otherwise, going back to the marriage counseling example, if you don't have that distinction, and if you work only at the optional things, that's not going to help you or your spouse. You need to be absolutely clear, what is essential to me and in what order? And I remember working with this client, her name was Kate, and she had been struggling for 3 years whether to stay or to, actually 5 years whether to stay or to go. She had been married for 20 and struggling for 5. And in the end, when we went through that process, it came out that her husband fulfilled 70% of the things that she valued in a relationship. And you could say on paper, wow, that's pretty good. Unfortunately, in terms of the essentials, her first top 5 things, the first 5 most important things to her were not fulfilled. And when she saw that, not only logically, but in a visual way that I'm going to talk about in a moment, that was a huge eye-opener for her, because it's not about how many are fulfilled, it's which ones are fulfilled or not.
Makes sense, yes.
Okay, perfect. Then the next step is, and by the way, since we have a little more time, I'm going to introduce also a concept of understanding about deal breakers, because I distinguish between 2 types of deal breakers. The first one is what I call an instant deal breaker, and it's very subjective. For some people, it may be, if my husband cheats on me, that's it, I'm done. If my husband does drugs, that's it, I'm done. If, I don't know, they abuse me physically, that's it, I'm done. Whatever that is, it's very subjective. It's one thing, once that happens, that's it, I'm done. But the women considering divorce who are stuck in indecision are not facing this kind of deal breaker because they would already have made a decision.
Right.
So there's a second kind of deal breaker that is much more subtle, yet very important to understand. I call that a cumulative deal breaker. It means that it's the effect of it over time that makes it a no-go. And let me give you an example. Let's say that you go to the restaurant and you get there, it's a good restaurant, but there is renovations next door and there's construction noise. Well, if the restaurant owner tells you, you know what, yeah, there's noise, but it will be over in 5 minutes, you say, okay, you know what, I'll put up with it, and then we'll have a great meal. But if the restaurant owner tells you it's going to go on for the next 3 hours, it's no go, because that doesn't work, right? So that's one subtle kind of deal breaker that you need to become aware of in terms of, okay, if this keeps being present consistently long-term, can I put up with it or not? But in order for you to detect that, you need to have a very clear understanding of what's essential versus optional. And this is not as easy as it sounds, because we have to deal with 20 to 30 variables, and that's a lot of variables. And let me show you an example. Again, I like people finding their own answer. So have you ever gone to the restaurant and you look at the menu and you are not sure what food to order? Did that ever happen to you?
Oh, a lot of times. Yep.
Okay. And the reason this happens is that most of the time, we have some things that are important to us in the back of our mind that we're looking for. We may not be consciously aware of them, but they're happening. For most people, it's not universal, but for most people, they want something that is tasty, healthy, and reasonably priced. Let's take those 3. And if you have an item on the menu that fulfills all 3, it's a go, go, go. If nothing fulfills any of those values, it's a no, no, no. The problem arises when some things are fulfilled, but not others. And then it becomes this yes, but, endless loop. And we get lost just with 3 variables. Our mind has a hard time on this, making sense of 3 variables. And what you will end up ordering at the restaurant depends on what is more important versus less important. If you value taste over health, you'll get the burger. If you want health versus taste, maybe getting the salmon with the salad, and so forth, right? So that's why you need to understand the order of importance, but also you need to be able to deal with a large number of variables, because our mind gets lost with just 3 variables, forget about 20 to 30. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So I have developed this kind of very systematic step-by-step process to be able to establish a proper order so that you know what's essential versus what's optional. Now, once you have those elements, you have built what I call the decoding grid. That's the name of my process. But as we said, it kind of gives you a logical understanding, because now you know all the things that are important to you. You can express them verbally in terms of what each one of them means to you and how to know whether they're being fulfilled or not. You can tell whether they're being fulfilled or not, but then you still need to communicate that clarity with the primal part of your brain, which is, and your emotional part of your brain, which are the gatekeepers of your decision. So then it becomes a question of displaying that clarity in a visual way. And this decoding grid that I have developed is taking all the things that are important to you, distinguishing between what is essential versus optional, and then applying that like a key answer sheet that you apply to multiple choices questionnaires.
Right.
You know what I'm talking about? It's like, you get the students, they give you the answers, and you want to be able to grade those answers quickly. Just put it on, and immediately at a glance of an eye, you see what is right and what is wrong. And this decoding grid process that I have developed gives you an immediate visual representation of the health of your relationship. And first, you focus, do I have any deal breakers? Because if there's a deal breaker, everything else becomes a moot point. Is that in the red area, or in the green area, or in the blue area? What about my essentials? Are they in the red zone, or in the green zone, or in the blue zone? And once you have that holistic, you are able to evaluate your relationship all at once visually. That's when your logical mind clicks with your emotional and intuitive selves or brains to say, okay, now I get it. Now, not only can I understand and explain what's important to me and why it didn't work, but I can see that there's too much red for me to be able to save this relationship. And I'm going to share a story to illustrate that. I had Kim, she had been married for 25 years. And since the beginning, she had doubts, but again, she couldn't verbalize those doubts, those second thoughts or second guessings logically, so she shoved them under the rug. And for 25 years, she was unhappy in the relationship. To the point that, but life went on. They had a son together. But then she had actually met another person. And for the previous 3 years, she had had an affair. Now, I do not judge, absolutely not. We all make the best possible choices that we can in our lives. What was happening is that this other man had left his wife and was waiting for Kim to leave her husband. But she was confused. She didn't know what to do. And her son knew that she had had an affair, and he couldn't take it anymore. He said, Mom, you need to make a decision. I cannot lie to that and this anymore. But she knew that whatever decision she would make, people would suffer, either her husband or the other man. She was lost. So once I guided her through this process, she understood all the things that were important to her, in which order, what was essential, what was optional. The beauty of it was that she was able to assess her marriage and her relationship on its own merits, regardless of having met this other man. She was able to really see that her relationship could never work because there were too many reds in the essentials areas. Like if you take the car to the mechanic and it says, the brakes are not working, your transmission is almost done, the steering wheel, doesn't work properly, steering fluid. Well, you may be able to go on for a few more miles, but it's going to break down, right?
Right.
And once she had that awareness, it was like a slap in the face. It's like, okay, now I get it. Not only on an emotional level, but also on a logical level. Yes, things will never work with my husband because there's just too much to change for him. Even if he wanted to, even if he had the best of intentions, that would be asking him to, for him to have a personality transplant. Just too many things to change, right? And once she had that awareness, the next question became, well, what about this other man? Was I with him just because it was a little bit better than my husband, but maybe he's not a good fit either? And when we assess this other man, what was mind-blowing is that it was all in the green zone, like the essentials, the optionals. It was a quasi-perfect match. And when she saw that visually and contrasted the two relationships side by side, that's it. The answer was obvious. She knew it logically, but most of all, emotionally and intuitively. And even though she had been afraid of confrontation before and afraid of talking to her husband, she was able to talk calmly to her husband to explain to him that it wasn't that he was a bad person. It simply was not a good fit. And 1 week later, she decided to leave her husband and to pursue a better life. But that would have not been possible if she didn't have what I call decision harmony, meaning this alignment between her head, her heart, and her gut, which is having clarity, knowing what's important to you, in which order, what's essential, what's optional, whether there are any clear deal breakers, and how to present this information in a visual way that all parts of your brain that are the gatekeeper of your decision get at a visceral level. Does that make sense?
It makes so much sense. And it's, this philosophy needs to be used on a daily basis for all of our relationships, and especially our relationship with ourselves. I know
Yes.
as a woman for the majority of my life, I'm 74 years old. As I turned 60 and got pushed out of corporate America, I knew it was a good thing for me physically, because I was not in line with their culture. I was doing a great job, loved what I was doing, but as soon as I had to intermingle with the culture at the company, I was miserable. And so when I got pushed out the door, my son said to me, "Mom, I want you to put pros and cons. You're so angry at them for what just happened." And when I did that, there were so many pros why this was the best thing for me. And then as soon as I did that, it was like, now I have some clarity, didn't understand the whole process, but the pit in my stomach had gone away. And it was like, okay, I can start moving forward. And I've gone through this with my marriage with my husband. Okay. And as you talked about, I never thought about it, but there are a lot of things on that list that he's never going to do. And I've had to realize, how important is it? Why do I think it's so important that when the dishwasher is empty and there are dishes in the sink, that he doesn't put dishes in? And it's like, well, it may be important for the moment, but really overall, it's not important. And so I don't carry those things around with me. And a lot of people do. It's like, oh, you didn't do the dishes today. Bad person. I'm going to get mad at you. And this is going to be, World War III. So I love what you're doing. And now I understand how you can talk to women. And I also think that women probably feel more comfortable talking to you about their issues than they do with another woman, because we think we're being judged by other women.
Interesting point. As I said, we all make the best possible choices that we can in the moment. We all try our best. Now, does it mean we make a choice that we may have done differently with hindsight? But hindsight is 2020, right? This is how we learn in life. So if I may, it's so funny that you mentioned this concept about, the dishwasher, because I remember I had this client, Tracy, and she was in a very similar situation. It was her second marriage. She wasn't sure. And one of the things that really rubbed her against the grain was that her husband was messy. The clothes on the floor, the dirty dishes in the sink, and so on. And she kept being aggravated by that. And that's why she kept going at. This is what she was trying to resolve with him. But when we did the process, it turned out that having a person who was being organized or neat was 21 out of 22. It was like the second to last and definitely an optional. And there was a huge aha moment. It's like, yes, I'd wish he'd be more organized, but you know what? I can put the dishes myself and wash them. Yep. And in the scheme of other things, the big needle movers, the things that matters, he fulfills those. So that's how she was able to actually save her marriage, because she suddenly knew what the leverage points were for her to focus on to make it work, instead of spending time, energy, and emotions on something that didn't matter. So yeah, I'm so glad that you brought that up.
So how can my listeners find you? Because you have a wealth of information, and maybe a few marriages can either be saved, or if it's time to, take the road and get out of the maze, and maybe that's their answer as well.
So I have written a book. It's called Divorce Decision Decoded, because that's exactly what it is. It's Divorce Decision Decoded. And the website that people can find me on is 𝗪𝗔𝗿𝗂𝗃 conveniently. So 𝗪𝗔𝗿𝗃.com. This is where you can find the book that I wrote. I'm really on a life mission to share this process. So I spill all the beans in the book. I hold nothing back. So you can get the book. At the time of this recording, you will also get the audiobook version for free as a free bonus. And the reason I spill all the beans and provide as much value is because, number one, it is part of my life mission. And number two is also because I know that a number of people, some people are very good at taking a book and then they follow through on all their resolutions, and then they take the time and effort and then the number of hours required to apply everything. And I also know that some women will want to have the help, the assistance, the comfort, the speed, the certainty of the result of working with an expert. So on that website, divorcedecisiondecoded.com, you can also contact me, send me an email, or book a call for us to discuss on the phone to see exactly what your situation is, how these concepts apply, and the best possible way that we could work together and that I can help you make this decision with decision harmony. So
I'm so grateful because, when I started coaching a little over a year ago, many of my concepts are similar to yours, but not as formalized. And I always tell people that when I start going through a coaching, what is it that you really want? But don't tell me today. Take your time, because it took me time. When I was pushed out and it was like, what do I want to do? And my son actually sat with me here in the office and he said, what do you really want to do? And I was getting angry at him. It's like, we got to worry about you doing what you want to do. You're the young adult. And he said, no, you're not going to sit in that chair and stare at four walls because you don't have a job. And I remember telling him to get out of the room. And I don't like writing with paper and pen anymore. And I sat here at my computer and I was making my lists. And it was like, wow, that's what I want to do. Where did that come from? But I pondered it, okay? Because it was like, I want to do more writing, but I've always been told I'm really not a good writer. So how do I do that? And it was like, well, if you don't write, you're never going to get any better. And then I started sending it to people who were writers. And I said, need you to look at this. And when they would come back and say, hey, you've got the talent. It was like, well, I didn't hear that I had the talent. Just tell me that, I'm just okay. And it was like, no, we got to tell you that you have the talent. And that's how it was like, okay, now I know what I can do. I know what I want to do. I'm going to get there. But to all our listeners, we evolve. So what we think we wanted to do yesterday might change tomorrow. And we need to be prepared. Mike, you are absolutely wonderful. I'm going to get out on your website, as I hope my listeners will. And thank you for an enjoyable podcast this morning.
Thank you for having me, Karen. It's always a pleasure interacting with wonderful hosts like you. You ask wonderful questions. And thank you for allowing me to share the message and to spread and, what I've discovered and to express my life mission. So I'm the one who's grateful.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day now. Bye-bye.
You too, Karen.